Welcome everyone to the Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics, meeting number 86. Pursuant to Standing Order 1083 HV, study of the subject matter of the report of the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner entitled the Trudeau Report. I just want to personally thank you, former Commissioner, for coming today. We know you certainly didn't have to be here, and also thank you for finishing your report before your exit. Proceed.
Okay, thank you. I have some opening remarks. Is this the time to start making them? Okay. So, Mr. Chair and honourable members of the committee, I understand you've invited me to appear before you today to speak about the Trudeau Report. I'm not sure what I can add to what I've said in the report, but I'll try to answer any questions the committee may have. J'ai émis le rapport.
I issued the Trudeau Report on December 20th, 2017. It highlights the conclusions of the study I conducted under the Conflict of Interest Act and from the investigation I conducted under the Conflict of Interest Code for members of the House of Commons. Today, I will limit my remarks to questions related to the Act, given the committee's mandate.
Now I understand that you do want to talk about amendments that I've proposed to, and we'll see what we can do about that. It's not what I've focused on the last couple of weeks, but I have a copy here of them and whatnot. I launched the examination and inquiry into Mr. Trudeau's conduct in January 2017 in response to requests for investigation from two members of the House of Commons. Those requests were prompted by media coverage of a vacation that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his family, along with several friends and their families, took on a private island owned by the Aga Khan from December 26, 2016 to January 4th, 2017. I subsequently learned that Mr. Trudeau, his family, and other relatives had also vacationed on the island in December 2014, and members of his family and their guests had done so in March 2016 as well. The Aga Khan, as the founder and chair of various charitable organizations, has a long-standing relationship with the Government of Canada, which since 1981 has contributed nearly $330 million to projects supported by the Aga Khan Canada Foundation. The Foundation's CEO is registered to lobby the Government of Canada, including the Prime Minister's office. Briefly, I found that Mr. Trudeau contravened four provisions of the Conflict of Interest Act, namely Sections 5, 11, 12, and 21. I found that he did not contravene two other provisions, Sections 6, 1, or 7 of the Act. And I also found that he did not contravene the Members' Code. As most of my findings hinged on Mr. Trudeau's acceptance on behalf of himself and his family of the gifts of vacations on the Aga Khan's private island, I'll speak specifically about my findings of a contravention of subsection 11.1 of the Act. Section 11.1 sets out the Act's gift rule. It prohibits public office holders and their family members from accepting any gift or other advantage that might reasonably be seen to have been given to influence the public office holders in the exercise of an official power, duty, or function. The test is not whether the donor intended to influence the recipient or whether the recipient was indeed influenced, but whether it might reasonably be seen that the gift or other advantage was given for that reason. The evidence showed that there was ongoing official business between the Government of Canada and the Aga Khan and his institutions at the time each invitation to visit the island was accepted, and that Mr. Trudeau, as Prime Minister, was in a position to be able to advance some of the matters of interest to the Aga Khan, whether he did so or not. I therefore found that the gifts could reasonably be seen to have been given to influence Mr. Trudeau in the exercise of an official power, duty, or function. Subsection 11.2 sets out a number of exceptions to the gift rule set out in 11.1, including where the gift or other advantage is from a relative or friend. So I had to consider whether Mr. Trudeau and the Aga Khan were friends for the purposes of the Act. Interestingly, that exception is not in the Code. There's not an exception for friends in the Code. The Act does not define the word friend. It's a word that's used in different ways by different people and can apply to a range of relationships from the closest of lifelong companions to neighbors, colleagues, acquaintances, or business associates who see each other only occasionally and where there's little emotional attachment. Mr. Trudeau's relationship with the Aga Khan was based on a family connection rooted in a friendship between the Aga Khan and Mr. Trudeau's father. However, Mr. Trudeau had no personal or private interactions with the Aga Khan from 1983 until 2013, when Mr. Trudeau became leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, other than on the occasion of his father's funeral. These factors led me to conclude that their relationship cannot be described as one of friends for the purposes of the Act, bearing in mind that friends can have all sorts of different meanings to different people. Instead, it appears to be one of two world leaders with common ideas and goals who have great respect for one another and whose families share a connection. I also observed in the Trudeau report that Mr. Trudeau said that he felt that as Prime Minister, he could now pursue a friendship with the Aga Khan. However, public office holders must put on hold the pursuit of friendships with individuals with whom they are likely to have official dealings when they are in public office. The Trudeau report has focused renewed attention on the Conflict of Interest Act and its perceived weaknesses, particularly the lack of penalties for breaches of its substantive provisions. The only penalties it provides for are administrative monetary penalties, which the Commissioner may impose on reporting public office holders who fail to meet certain reporting requirements of the Act. I'm not of the view myself that more stringent penalties are required. It was never Parliament's intention that the Act form part of the criminal system. Indeed, the Act requires that the Commissioner suspend an examination and notify the relevant authorities if he or she has reasonable grounds to believe that an offence has been committed under another Act of Parliament. In my view, publicity and the test of re-election make up the appropriate reform of redress for contraventions of the Act and are sufficient to encourage compliance. I also wish to address some comments that have been made on the time required to complete this report. In my years as Commissioner, I conducted all of my examinations thoroughly and with a high degree of diligence, in keeping with the standards and practices that I established for the office, the requirements of the Act, and respect for procedural fairness. In each of my reports, I provided a detailed description of the process that was followed and the information that was obtained. The amount of time that it took to complete this or any other examination depended on a number of factors. They included the number of investigations underway, the number of case files being reviewed, and the delays in scheduling witnesses and obtaining relevant documents from a variety of sources, as well as the report drafting and editing process, which can take some time as well. Before I conclude my opening statement, I note that the committee has undertaken to conduct a new review of the Act in early 2018. My experience in the last 10 years has been that the Act has worked well overall. However, I believe there's room for improvement, and I listed a large number of suggestions in the submission I made to this committee at the time of the 5-year review. I'd be pleased to discuss my recommendations for amendments with the committee when it takes up the study. So now I'll be happy, I hope, to answer any questions the committee may have.
Thank you, former Commissioner. I don't know how to refer to you anymore other than Mrs. Dawson or Ms. Dawson, but...
That's fine. You can call me Mary if you like. I don't
Mary
mind.
will work. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you once again, Mary. First up, for 7 minutes, Mr. Erskine-Smith.
So thanks very much for attending here today and for all of your work over the years. I said yesterday that the report speaks for itself. Do you think that would be a fair statement?
Yeah.
You, in your 2013 recommendations, and of course we are in early 2018, and we'd committed to undertake a study of the Act and in fact invite you to discuss your 2013 recommendations. One of those recommendations was adding administrative monetary penalties for breaches of the Act's substantive provisions. And perhaps you could speak a little bit to that and what punishments, you've spoken a little bit about in your opening statement, but what additional punishments you were asking to see in the Act.
Yeah, I probably named a few in my report, and I've forgotten what they were now. But what I really meant was just the odd one that was kind of easy to sort of, not a complicated one that took a lot of investigation to figure out. I mean, I've used other mechanisms like compliance orders occasionally when I want to do something a little more quickly. But those administrative monetary penalties are meant to make sure people get their reports in time, that sort of thing. They're deadlines.
To bring it back to the Trudeau report, we have a Prime Minister who immediately apologized upon the release of your report, accepted the findings, and used the language of "I take full responsibility," committed to implementing measures in his office to communicate with the future or now current Ethics Commissioner such that something like this would never happen again. What more should the Act require?
I think that's probably all the Act should require. I mean, I don't. There's a political overlay here, and that's not my bailiwick. But as far as I'm concerned, the Act has done what it needs to do.
You, in 2013, recommended increasing transparency around gifts and other advantages. Would any of those recommendations be relevant for the purposes of the Trudeau report?
Yes, I had a number of different kinds of recommendations on transparency of gifts. For example, reporting public office holders have to report gifts if they're worth over $200. Non-reporting public office holders don't have to do that. That, I think, was one of the examples I gave of one of the reporting requirements that might be put on a non-reporting public office holder. I also had some discussions on the level, the $200 limit, because the $200 limit creates no end of confusion. And a couple of years go by, and if you haven't talked about it, people forget. They think if it's under $200, it's okay. That's not the rule. The rule is no gift is okay, except I've got.
Just need to $30 to make it clear for.
I had guidelines that were 10 or 12 pages long with lots of detailed instructions on how to handle exceptions to the gifts and things.
Now, you didn't order any reimbursement in the Trudeau report. Do you think the reimbursement rules, I know you didn't have any, in 2013, any recommendations for improving such rules. Do you think those rules in the Act are sufficient as well?
There are no rules on reimbursement in the...
Well, on tickets and invitations, I understand that there are.
Sorry?
On tickets and invitations in the Act, I understand that there are.
Oh, that's not a rule in the Act. That's a way to get out from under having received a gift that you shouldn't have received.
Understood.
Basically. I mean, if you do it within your 30 days, you haven't created an offense.
Sure. That makes sense. So we have a Prime Minister who apologized and said that he made a mistake, and I think you've been fair in your opening statement to say there are different definitions of friend, and the Act has, in your view, particular interpretation. And obviously, as we might talk about a neighbor, we would use the word friend differently for maybe what the Act considers. Do you think the Prime Minister, it was an honest mistake? Do you think that the Prime Minister intentionally knew it was wrong and went ahead and did it anyway? You've had conversations with the Prime Minister that we haven't had. What's your view of the Prime Minister's mindset and intention in this?
Well, I take the Prime Minister at his word, and I've reported a number of things he said in the report. I'm not going to report anything that I didn't put in the report. As I said, I can't. Anything I do is confidential, except what I feel is necessary to report. But this was almost double the length of any report I've done. I tried to make it as fulsome as I could. I'm sure there are statements in there that answer that question that you've just asked.
Do you think it's... There are two Prime Ministers who have vacationed with the Aga Khan. They're both, their last names are both Trudeau. We have the first invitation to our Prime Minister was not when he was Prime Minister, of course, but when he was the leader of a third-place party. And your view in the Act and in the report is that he was invited on the basis of his office. But based on the fact that he was invited when he was in third place, based on the fact that Mr. Mulroney and Mr. Harper and previous Prime Ministers not named Trudeau did not vacation with the Aga Khan, perhaps it has something to do with the last name Trudeau and not the office of Prime Minister.
I didn't say that was the only reason why he was invited. I gave 3 or 4 factors. And when you're making a decision under a piece of legislation, every case is a little bit different. And you look at the various factors that you've got in front of you, and you make a judgment call as to whether something's the case. So I'm not quite sure if that answers your question, but basically there was no one factor that led me to my conclusion here.
Okay. The other question I had was just about implications for world leaders interacting. We have the Aga Khan is not your average lobbyist, of course. He's a spiritual leader of 15 million.
All under our...
Well, he's a chair of a foundation that is a registered lobbyist, as I understand. So it's not your typical situation, though. He is also a spiritual leader of 15 million Ismaili Muslims. And where we have a situation where you have world leaders building bridges, and the goal is to increase friendship in many ways between these world leaders and to improve relations. Do you think that a rule such as this, I'll use a hypothetical. Theresa May invites the Prime Minister to her private residence and talks about free trade and has an agenda in talking about free trade because they've just left the EU. Is Trudeau in accepting that gift of the private residence? Is that a concern that we should, as a Canadian public, be concerned about?
No, I think, you know, world leaders, there's world leaders and then there's political leaders. And you know, this has been a very interesting exercise because it raised all sorts of interesting questions. But you know, obviously, world leaders have to have relationships with each other, and it's a good thing for the country that they have relationships with each other. I think in this case, the problem was there were specific requests that were being made for funding from the Government of Canada. But you know, the Government of Canada has had, as I say in here, a long, very good relationship with the Aga Khan. But he's you know, I tried to sort of make comparisons between relationships with Obama, for example,
Sure.
and that sort of thing. And I mean, you can make all sorts of interesting discussions around that. But fact of the matter is that I think the Aga Khan he's almost like a pope. Sort of. That's the closest thing I could assimilate him to. In fact, he's a leader of a religious group, and you know, they have very interesting and good tenets. I learned a little bit about the Ismaili religion in doing this report, and I found it quite interesting. But sorry, I'm wandering off. I'm not sure quite what answer you're looking for.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Erskine-Smith. Next up for 7 minutes, Peter Kent.
Thank you, Chair, and Happy New Year, and thank you, Commissioner, for attending today. As I said when you entered the room this morning, I think you deserve the lingering honorific, at least this close to your stepping down from office. Now, the Prime Minister has said he fully cooperated with you and your office through the year. But we learned from your report that after you began your investigation and made the initial invitation for the Prime Minister to meet with you and to discuss the allegations or complaint against him, that it took fully 2 months for him to make time to see you. Did you see that as something less than full cooperation?
I mean, no, given that he's the Prime Minister and he's got lots of stuff on his plate and he had travels and stuff, I mean, what can I say? It took a bit of time, but other people have taken similar amounts of time. And, you know, I was getting documentation as well during that period, but that was the first face-to-face meeting I had. So
you would characterize in that first meeting in April and then the latter meeting in October, there was full cooperation, no reluctance, no disputing any
I didn't have the sense there was a reluctance, no.
Okay. Now, your report is thorough and detailed, as you say. It's an exceptionally a detailed report, somewhat longer than most of the reports from your office over the last 10 years now.
It actually has the record. It's the longest.
It has the record. And your findings in the 4 areas where you found the Prime Minister clearly violated the Act are very clear. Now, he has yet to address your findings in the report with members of Parliament. It was released by your office a week after the House rose.
And believe me, I tried very hard to get that out as quickly as I could. In fact, I worked very hard that last couple of weeks to get it out before I was gone.
And I'm not finding fault at all, Commissioner. Yesterday, as you probably know, the Liberal members of this committee voted against a motion to invite the Prime Minister to come to this calm and respectful setting to discuss your findings with the members.
Hopefully
And
it stays that way.
He said in a news conference yesterday that his only conversation needs to be with you. I'm wondering whether you feel, in retrospect, as a former commissioner, that the Prime Minister has a duty and responsibility, now that you have made these findings in the Trudeau report, that he has a responsibility to address them with his fellow members of Parliament.
You know, I have the utmost respect for Parliament, but I think it's Parliament that decides the answer to that question. I mean, it's not for me, the former Ethics Commissioner, to say what action either Parliament or the Prime Minister should take. I would not wade into that.
Now, respecting the confidential aspect of remarks made to the Prime Minister that you don't refer to in your report, could I ask you in general, did any of his answers to you take less than 35 seconds? Which is as we all know, but the public may not know, is the length of time for the Prime Minister to answer questions in question period.
There was a variety of different lengths of answers.
But I would guess that very few of them were less than 35 seconds.
Oh, there was probably a yes or no hither and yon.
Right. Could I ask you, were there any times when the Prime Minister requested to submit a written response or a correction of a response that he made during the interviews with you?
Was there any time that he would request that?
Well, did he make any written, did he have any written correspondence?
I mean, the Prime Minister had lawyers, and there were some submissions made by the lawyers, as I think I mentioned. Part of my process, maybe I should just say what the normal process is towards the end of,
Sure.
of doing a report. I will have a last interview with, like I always have a first interview and a second interview, unless the person doesn't want the second interview. Or I tell them I don't think it's necessary and they don't care. But usually there's a second interview, and after that second interview, I then sort of team back and finalize my facts. When I'm ready and I think the facts are complete, I will share them with the person that's alleged to have contravened. And then they are given a couple of weeks to come back and tell me whether they think there's anything they think I've misrepresented, or they think there's a little additional thing they think is necessary to add or something. Many don't, and some do. Then after that happens, I then team back again, and I take into account any comments they make. And because, of course, due process is the whole underpinning of this. And then I proceed to finalize my analysis and the report. And then it has to be, I have an editor, it gets edited, then it goes to translation, and then it's released.
So you were, or the Prime Minister was well aware, weeks before Parliament rose in December, of your findings, your fundamental findings in the report?
Of the findings, but not the conclusions. The conclusions are not shared.
Right.
But the position, like always in my reports, I have the person that's alleged to have contravened position, and that, for example, they check as well.
Okay. Did you or your office receive any communications from the Prime Minister's office or the Privy Council office or from lawyers concerning the timing of the eventual release of the report?
No. No, it was more me.
Now, one of the elements of the report that hasn't received a great deal of discussion involved your findings regarding the bilateral meeting with the Aga Khan, from which you found the Prime Minister should have recused himself, and where he justified the meeting on the basis that he considered he was there only to build relationships. He wasn't there in an official capacity. And I'm just wondering whether we should be concerned, whether Canadians should be concerned that this may extend to his attitude with regards to compliance with the Conflict of Interest Act with others seeking favors or funding from the Government of Canada. Does he not see himself as did he not consider himself as responsible as all other MPs and public office holders are to the articles of the Conflict of Interest Act?
You know, I don't think there's much I can say to that statement. I know it's a political discussion point. I think he's certainly taken cognizance of the decision that was made in this report, and I think it will have an effect on his thinking.
Going forward.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kent. Next up, for 7 minutes, Mr. Cullen.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Ms. Dawson. As I mentioned to you just before we got started, I'm of course interested in the largest report you've ever done and some of those findings and the learning that we can take not just from what happened in this instance, but going forward as parliamentarians. So I thank you for accepting the committee's invitation. Hopefully you have found the discourse civil, and it'll stay that way for our time together.
See that it stays that way.
I'll do my best, you know. I foresee no reason why not. So I wanted to circle back to something that exists within the Act. Is it, if I were to have received, or a member of Parliament received a gift that was deemed inappropriate, I could pay it back within 30 days, I think you said?
Well, unless you'd eaten it or something, I suppose you could pay.
Unless I'd eaten it? Is that right? Okay.
No, sorry. Yes. I mean, basically, the thing is, the funny thing in our Act is that there's the penalties are for failures to meet deadlines, and there's a deadline of 30 days to tell me that you've received a certain gift.
Right.
So if somebody receives a gift and then thinks, oh my God, I shouldn't have received this gift, and they decide they'll pay for it, then it sort of erases itself.
Right. So that's an option available.
But it has to do with whether they get an admin monetary penalty.
Right, but that monetary penalty is, as you said, was an encouragement to file.
Yeah.
That people were just slow on filing.
And sometimes people will accept a gift and come in and say, gosh, I wonder if we should have accepted this gift.
Right.
And I'll say no, or I say yes, whatever. And they'll return it.
Right, and then what?
And that's the end of it. If they've returned it within 30 days. So they haven't told me about it for a year. I think I did a case like that once and found that they'd contravened the Act.
Right. Oh. So, under this scenario, if the Prime Minister returns from this trip and says, you know, this doesn't seem right, because is it correct to say a few days after returning, a meeting was held, or a number of days after? When did the meeting?
You know what? It's in the Act. It's in the report, and it's in fairly close proximity.
Okay, so take that to the side.
Yeah.
If upon returning back to Canada from the Bahamas, or from the Caribbean, the Prime Minister said, you know, that didn't feel right, you know, going on a trip with the family and friends with somebody who lobbies my office or whose foundation lobbies my office. I'm going to pay for it. I'm going to figure out what the cost, if I had just decided to go on a trip to the Caribbean, what would your involvement have been at that point? His office could have notified you and said, this trip happened over the holidays, the Prime Minister took it, but then paid for it, reimbursed.
Would have been much better to check before.
Of course, that's the ideal, is check. Don't ask for permission, not forgiveness.
Yeah.
Right?
But the fact of the matter in this case is that I didn't know about any of this stuff for a long time.
So the highest bar would be, hey, I'm thinking of taking this trip, Ethics Commissioner, but it's a trip being offered to me from somebody who also lobbies my office. Is it okay? And
I think I've heard the Prime Minister's statements now that he's going to check with the office all the time when he's taking a trip.
I bet.
So it had an effect.
But if not getting that higher bar, another bar down is if a trip was accepted inappropriately, or a gift of some kind, a painting, whatever, a watch, and the person said, oh, now that I think about it, that's inappropriate, they're going to pay the person back for the gift.
Yeah.
You don't have really anything to do with it at that point. Or do you? You might get notified, but you're not going to follow that up.
You know what? Hypotheticals are very difficult to deal with, because every time you've got an issue that you have to deal with, you have to look at it fresh in the general context.
Sure.
And there's no one case that's going to be an exact, perfect model for a decision on a next case.
Yeah. But there's some learnings that we need to take from this, as you've said.
Yeah.
Because it's an interesting case.
Yeah.
We've never had a prime minister found in violation of the act before. Can I also circle back to this point about the prime minister's statement that in being in a meeting with the Aga Khan, he was not there in his official capacity, but in his capacity as in relationship building or as a friend? Did I hear you right?
Yeah, well, you see, those tests are reasonably seen to have been given. The tests are objective as opposed to subjective. I'm not sure this is answering the specific question you're asking, but each section is drafted a little bit differently, and so you have to kind of look at the exact.
No, but I'm just trying to clarify sort of not even a philosophical point, maybe a legal point, which is if the prime minister then, or anybody who having received a gift and there being this sort of association, says, well, I'm in the meeting, but they're just a friend. I'm not there in my official capacity as a member of parliament or prime minister or cabinet minister.
Right.
That was the argument I understood he made and that you reiterated this morning. Did I hear you wrong?
Well, I think there was 2 or 3 different instances where the circumstances were different.
Yeah.
Sometimes he was there in his official capacity. Sometimes he was there when things were being discussed.
Right.
And sometimes he was there, I don't know, out of courtesy because they were wanting to meet the leaders. Every case where there was a meeting was different. So you have to figure out which one you're talking about.
Is in all of those cases, he's still the prime minister.
Actually, he was the leader of the Liberal Party.
Well, the previous ones, but the meetings that then followed,
there was one when he was a member, but there was no consequence.
Right. Well, but even as member of parliament, as leader of a federal party, as then prime minister.
Right.
I just don't imagine a scenario in which I say, I'm taking that elected hat off, and I'm just here, I'm just hanging out with a buddy. Like that doesn't, because if you follow that line of logic, you could be popping hats off and on.
It depends on
at almost a convenient nature.
I mean, if you're meeting with an old school buddy that has nothing to do with anything that the government's doing.
But if I'm meeting with somebody who does have something to do with what the government is doing, $330 million.
So you're talking about a specific case.
Sure I am.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but if my old school buddy is also somebody who lobbies the government, and
then you better be careful.
You'd think. Yeah.
Yeah.
You better be careful. I got the sense from your original testimony that your definition of friendship is actually quite broad.
I mean, there's lots of people I would say.
You're not restrictive in your nature of thinking of friends.
No, it depends. It's a circumstantial thing as well.
Sure.
A friend is probably the broadest. I mean, I have several cases on friendship, and I mean, there was one guy exonerated because I really didn't think he was a friend. He was just like to drop a name. I mean, the circumstances, you just have to look at each case and figure out what you're doing.
So thank you, Mr. Cullen.
I'll come back.
I'm sure there'll be more time. Next up for 7 minutes, Mr. Saini.
Good morning, Commissioner. I will refer to you as Commissioner because I still think of you as the Commissioner.
Well, I think that should be, anyway, former Commissioner maybe.
Well, okay, former Commissioner. But anyway, I want to thank you very much for coming. I know that you noted in the press that this report almost killed you and you needed some rest.
That was an overstatement.
And I'm glad that you're here in full health.
Yeah.
And as a pharmacist, if there's anything I can offer in terms of your health, I would be more than happy to do that. Well, she's a former commissioner. I have a couple of specific questions regarding the report and a couple of general questions. As a new MP, I would like to explore the question of friendship a little bit more broadly. Just referring to your report, on page 30 of your report, you lay out the test that must be applied when determining whether a breach of Section 14 of the Members' Code has taken place. If I understand this test is used in order to determine whether or not a gift may be seemed to have influence. Now, you determined that there was no contravention of Section 14.
Because there was no business.
What kind of process and procedure did you use or ensure, just so we get an understanding of whether...
Sorry?
What kind of procedure or process did you use to ensure the test was applied fairly and appropriately?
I'm not sure what kind of an answer you're looking for. I mean,
you mentioned in your report that there was a test that you had that applied. I'd just like you to explore a comment on that test that you used, how it was applied.
Well, I don't know quite how I used that. I have to look at the exact wording, but basically, what you have to do is see whether it could be seen to have been given to influence you, if it's a gift. And so you stand back and you say, well, what would a reasonable man on the Clapham omnibus, as they say in legalese, think? So you try and stand back and take an objective reading of something.
Okay. Also, in your analysis of Section 7 of the Conflict of Interest Act, you note that no evidence exists that the treatment the Aga Khan or his institutions received from this Prime Minister was more favorable than the treatment received by previous Prime Ministers. Is that correct?
That's on the Section 7 investigation, yeah.
So given that, is it fair to say that while you conclude that while certain behaviors may have been inappropriate, that there does not appear to be any evidence that this trip changed the relationship between the Aga Khan, his institutions, and the Office of the Prime Minister, or the Aga Khan, his institutions, and the Government of Canada?
You know what, I'm going to have to look at this. This is in Section 7, isn't
Yeah.
it? And you're saying, and sorry.
It's in your report.
Run that past me again. What page are you on?
You know what? Let's move on to another question. I'll ask a more general question.
All right.
Now, some of us in the medical community, we have, coming from different urban areas, whether a smaller urban area or a larger urban area. I mean, if you've been in medical practice for many years, you tend to accumulate a lot of patients.
Right.
And in a smaller area, those patients tend to have interactions with you publicly and privately, socially, and as patients. Sometimes you have friends who become your patients, and sometimes you have patients who become your friends.
Right.
So in that scenario, can you kind of comment on how one should approach the test of friendship, what the definition of friendship, what should be the guidelines that should be followed?
Yeah, well, I think you keep your, and I think I've got a paragraph in here somewhere in this report where I say, look, when you get into a position where you are of power, and you have, some kind of a relationship that may be developing, well, watch out in the development of that friendship, because whenever you're in a position of power and somebody is in a position where they're wanting to get something from you, then that is a situation where you have to be very careful. And
so do you think that the term friendship should be defined in the Act?
I don't think you could ever define it properly.
But the
trouble is it means many different things to different people.
Should there be some guiding criteria, some guidelines?
Friendship is used right the way through the Act because it's in the definition or the quasi-definition of what a conflict of interest is. So it goes on both sides of the scale there on whether you can accept gifts or whether you can do favors when you're in a position. The interesting, I think I mentioned this in the course of my opening remarks, just as an aside, I'm not so sure it's very helpful to have that exception in the Act as I look at this whole situation. It isn't in the code. There's the reasonably seen to have been given to influence. There's a whole history on the code's gift thing, which I find interesting. I know you probably don't want to hear about, but there were a number of changes to that provision in the code, and it was tightened up back in about 2010. But anyway, it's never had an exception for friends specifically. So what you do is you take a look and say, well, could it reasonably be seen? And that's a better test. In the Act, there's no way that a friend should always obviate the obligation under Section 11. The real test should be, could it reasonably be seen to have been given to influence you? And having that exception for friends confuses the situation. I think an improvement, it's not an amendment I suggested in my original 89 or whatever they were, but it's one that has occurred to me since, and I think one could maybe take a page out of the code's approach and not have that as a specific exception.
I wanted to talk to you about that specific recommendation because in 2013 you said that Parliament should try to harmonize the Conflict of Interest Act and the Conflict of Interest Code for members. I mean, do you think that would be necessary, and do you think there would be benefits in harmonizing?
I think that attempts should be made to harmonize. I don't think it would be possible in all circumstances. Some rules need to be different but I'm just saying there's a lot of confusion created by slightly different usage of terminology in the two. For example, there's different, you know, the code goes and covers relatives and the act covers family. There's different terminology used and it has slightly different definitions. And what I'm really saying with that recommendation is, for heaven's sake, take a look. And I mean, the ministers are and the parliamentary secretaries are under both the old act and the code. And sometimes it might be useful if the same rule was there, if there's not a reason for there to be a different rule. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Saini. Up next for the 5-minute round, Mr. Gourde.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Dawson, for being with us today. I'm having a hard time hearing. Perhaps I'm better in English, so I perhaps may answer in English. Thank you very much for being here. I'd like to congratulate you for all the work you've done. I was very impatient to receive this report, and when I received it, I understood the extent of the work you did, the scope of the investigation, etc. So I'm not surprised it took you 11 months. But when you asked questions to the Prime Minister, did you ask him directly these questions, or was it addressed to the Prime Minister's office? I addressed them to the Prime Minister himself. I received responses from his lawyers, and I also had meetings with the PM. So you asked the questions to the PM, but his lawyers answered you, not him, the Prime Minister himself? Written? No. There were I received the answers from the Prime Minister. I can't remember what the document said. In your report, you said that some of your questions were discredited because the English and the French versions of the Act did not say the same thing. With regard to the plane, did the lawyers try to discredit your questions because of this? Because they want to figure out what type of aircraft was used? Did you want me to discuss this problem? Did the PM's lawyers try to discredit some of your questions? Yes? Okay. Did the Prime Minister's, were these the Prime Minister's personal lawyers or the Privy Council's legal team? No, it was the PM's lawyers. Yes, his own personal lawyers that he paid for this case. I imagine. No, you don't know. The Privy Council had nothing to do with this. Okay, good. I have a question about the third trip that with the Prime Minister's family when they went to this island. The Prime Minister's wife, friends, children. Was this trip requested by the family, or did Aga Khan's family insist on having the Prime Minister's family back to the island for a third time? I don't understand. Who requested the third trip? There was some conversation between the Prime Minister's wife and the daughter of Aga Khan. Did his daughter insist absolutely on having the Prime Minister's family back again in March 2016 on the island? Or did the Prime Minister's wife decide on the location and decided herself that she would go back? I have no idea. Response. But you did see some email exchanges there about this. What I put in the report, what I disclosed, is that there was no important information in these emails. Could this entire saga have been avoided if the Prime Minister would have requested your approval for the trips and with the issues regarding transportation? He could have told you, I have no choice but to take this trip. But would you have given your approval in this case? It depends. It would probably have depended on the information I was given. I would have been given, rather. If I had been asked a question about having a trip, taking a trip to Aga Khan's, I would have probably have discovered that EGACON did have ties with the Canadian government, and I would probably have asked questions, and there's a good chance that we would have given an opinion on this topic. The Prime Minister's legal team told you that there was exceptional circumstances and that the Prime Minister always has exceptional circumstances when he travels. Is this true? Did his lawyers say this? Did they ask you? Every time the Prime Minister travels, and every time we travel with him, there are always exceptional circumstances, and that other Prime Ministers prior to him, didn't necessarily have exceptional circumstances, but this is always the case for Prime Minister Trudeau. His lawyer just did not say that. It was Mr. Trudeau himself that said this. But he said, as I said in the report, Mr. Trudeau said that all of his trips were exceptional. And in some way, they are exceptional because he has a lot of security, etc. But what I'm saying here is that in these circumstances, we cannot use the argument that all travel is exceptional. We can't really say that the vacation we're talking about is exceptional. We knew the circumstances ahead of time. It was well planned. There was a helicopter that we were aware of ahead of time. And this was not... Sorry.
You know, it's interesting because the rules of the Prime Minister, the guidelines of the Prime Minister, require to check with the Commissioner, even if it is exceptional. And so there's a dissonance in those two rules as well. And but in any event, I found that it wasn't exceptional in this case, so it didn't matter.
Thank you, Mr. Gourde. Next up for 5 minutes, Mr. Picard.
Merci, Madame Dawson. Bonjour.
Hello, Ms. Dawson.
In your explanations, please do answer in the language of your choice to make me more easy. Don't worry with my question being in French.
Okay.
La définition d'ami.
The definition of friend, as you said, is very broad. And it's not very well defined as other definitions are in an act. For the public interest and for those who report this information, we have to understand the challenges that you're facing in circumstances where friendship is at stake. Do you have specific criteria? Are there criteria that you decide to establish to have a more objective approach with regard to what is or is not defined as friendship?
I've said a couple of times, you have to look at the circumstances, all the surrounding circumstances, to decide whether you should be applying an exception because they're a friend. That's why I'm suggesting, you know, it might be a very good idea to take that exception out. Because if you didn't have that exception in there, in most cases, if it was given to you by a friend, it would not be reasonably seen to have been given to influence you. And I think the addition of that exception creates an unnecessary burden of decision and not only that, it's insulting to the people that, you know, it's not nice if Mr. Trudeau has to be told or has to say, the Aga Khan's not a friend of mine, and he liked him, and you know, it just is the wrong. I think it's not helpful.
Est-ce que dans votre considération d'une relation?
In your findings with regard to this friendship, you considered. Did you consider the perception of the other side? Let me explain. In some cases, it would be impolite or even insulting to refuse an offer from someone else in terms of logistics. for the hospitality. So since it's a two-way relationship and there's two parties involved, did you also look at the cultural or ethic aspects with regard to this international relationship?
Cases where the cultural questions come in. There was, for example, cases of people, I think, in the citizenship area or the refugee area or something, and they may have been so thankful to have been heard by somebody in Canada that they'll bring a gift. Well, those are delicate situations that you have to deal with. But the way you have to deal with it is to say, look, in Canada, this creates a problem. And so we know, thank you, but, perhaps you could share it with everybody here or something, but I can't accept this gift, Now, that's a specific example of that kind of a cultural problem, but I think you have to abide by the expectations in this country to some extent, but you have to be very nice about it.
Donc, à la fin de la journée, dans un cas précis,
at the end of the day, in a specific case, whether a gift is eligible, it depends on the degree of friendship that is not defined, to the best of my knowledge, between a good friend and someone. So what criteria defines what is a friend? I had a friend up to the age of 14. We haven't seen each other for 40 years. We're still friends. We haven't seen each other for many years. There are cultural aspects, specific circumstances of this trip as well. There is a possibility that within the context of this trip with friends, there could be discussions that are professional in nature, but at the end of the day, there's only one person who decides as to whether this is eligible or not. It's you. So is that not subjective? I don't know if there's any other way of doing things.
As I keep saying, is different. You have to kind of judge it in the context. I have in the, I think the Watson report, I had a description of what a friend is. That was 8 years ago now. I might have changed that a little bit now. But, we're moving towards, and each time I've done a decision on friend, which I've done 2 or 3 of now, I try and give my reasons there. It's sort of an inductive system, maybe not familiar to the civil law mentality, more to the common law mentality, but I think we have to build up our precedents and understand it. But as I say, if we got rid of that exception, it might help.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Picard. Next up, Mr. Kent, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And Ms. Dawson, you observed in your report that in 2015 the Prime Minister issued a guidance document for ministers and ministerial exempt staff entitled Open and Accountable Government, and you found that he not only violated his own guidance letter, but as well the conflict of interest.
I made that comment. I'm not the judge of the guidelines.
No,
that's PCO.
well, no, absolutely.
But
as you say, in this case, the Prime Minister did not follow his own.
No,
rules.
if you look at that guideline, it says exceptional circumstances and consulted the commissioner, whereas the Act says or.
Were you surprised by the Prime Minister's that the Prime Minister didn't see the conflict in his decision to take this vacation, or that his advisors in the Prime Minister's office did not see the several areas of potential conflict and vulnerability?
Well, I think it's unfortunate. I don't know if I'm going to say surprised. I think some of these rules are not easy, and it's a question of getting your mindset into them. What can I say? I wouldn't say I was surprised.
Now, you've reminded us today that the penalties at the Commissioner's disposal are symbolic and rather small. They're meant to, I think, as you said...
They're meant so you can get your reports in time, basically.
Right. But you say that publicity and the prospect of re-election should be the consideration that anyone considering violation or knowingly or unknowingly.
Well, I'd like them just to do it because it was the right thing to do. But you know, those are the two things that I could see falling out.
And you have said that you don't believe that there should be stiffer penalties for violation of the Act. But this is an unusual violation in the sense that this improper vacation, the 4 violations that you found associated with the decisions and the actual vacation itself, generated almost $250,000 in costs to the Canadian taxpayer in security, in staff, in technology, friends and camp followers, if you will, taking part in this unauthorized vacation. Do you not see that there is some sort of moral, if not ethical, obligation beyond the mere payment of the equivalent of commercial airfares?
Well, you know, most of that, say that the Prime Minister had gone somewhere else on his own initiative, and it wasn't with a problematic person, and not that the Anglican's problematic. It wasn't in a problematic situation. A lot of those costs would have been incurred anyway.
Well, understood, but
I mean, the security costs are huge, I think,
right.
And actually, that's not my bailiwick at all. That was not my bailiwick. That is PCO or whoever helps, whoever pays that money. But I mean, there's a whole establishment there that looks after the Prime Minister's security. Sure. And that expense is incurred whatever he does.
Sure, and I would just say that many suggest that on personal vacations, particularly problematic personal vacations, there should perhaps be a better exercise of judgment in the amount of cost.
But you know, by the same token, you shouldn't be a prisoner. You know, just because you're a senior politician, you should be able to have a holiday occasionally.
Absolutely, no argument to that at all. And I'm sure Canadians enjoyed his observing his holiday from a distance in British Columbia this past couple of weeks. One other question. What are the requirements for a former member who benefits from a gift such as the Aga Khan vacation, who becomes a public office holder? Should that person record on the registry the fact that benefit was received from, in this case?
You know, a rule of thumb is we sort of generally look upon something that happened a year or two ago as long enough ago, but it depends a little bit. I mean, in other words, you know, if you had a holiday that somebody, or you got a gift from somebody or rather 5 years ago and then you became an MP, I don't think it's going to be a problem that you have to report.
But if a member a year ago on that vacation is now a public office holder, a minister, should he, in the
once he becomes
instance of transparency, should he make that record and say he will recuse himself from any involvement, perhaps with the Aga Khan's organization?
I think you're hitting a limit of 1 year, which is kind of where you have to think about it a little bit. That's kind of where we would look at it, I think. But you know, something that you did not as a public office holder, you don't have to report.
Right.
But you maybe should be cognizant of it if 3 months before you became somebody or other, and then you had a meeting or you had something where you were making a decision, then you should recuse. But it depends on the time and the whatever.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kent. Next up, Ms. Fortier. 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup. Moi aussi, Thank you very much. I'm also going to ask you questions in French, but please feel comfortable to answer in the language of your choice. First, I'd like to thank you, most importantly, for your office's cooperation. As a new member since last year, I know we ask a lot, and as a new MP, we always have to be careful. So your office was able to really answer my questions well. Thank you so much. Your report is also very exhaustive. So when I look at it, I'm able to ask you questions like my colleagues. I won't necessarily focus on this, but I would like to try to understand and learn in an evaluation context, since your investigation did last 11 months, I'm wondering if there were any stages or additional questions at the end of this exercise that we should look at in an upcoming investigation. Are there any other steps you'd like to add in an investigation process?
Le processus que nous avons.
I think that the process we have is very good. I can't think of any suggestions right now. And now, in terms of the Act, if it is reviewed, and given the exercise that you have just done over the past 11 months, do you have any new recommendations? We talked about definitions in terms of friendship, or additional definitions that should be revised with regard to definitions or exercise. Do you have any other suggestions? Not now. I did not give this any thought. Could you, after an exercise such as this one, make any suggestions or things that should be discussed? No, I don't think that this was an examination that was any different than any others. I followed the same processes. It wasn't anything special, except in terms of the person they concerned. Thank you. As I'm a new MP, in your report you mentioned that public office holders should cease developing friendships to people that will have to do activities with. Do you mean over several years? But if I were to become a public office holder and I had the privilege to remain so for a number of years, how would you recommend that I manage my new friendships within the exercise of my power? Do you have any suggestions for parliamentarians? There's a difference between new parliamentarians and those who are public office holders. But for both of these, the office, or my office, before, has always encouraged everyone to ask questions. Every member and public office holder has an advisor, and you can call them anytime to ask a question. Sometimes questions go to the commissioner, and I was always there to meet with people if this was requested. So I would simply say, ask questions if you have any problems or concerns. Also, you can read the guide. There are a lot of guidelines. But ask questions. It's easy. Ask your advisor. Yes, because if I understand correctly, there are many measures right now. And with the new revision of the Act, there could be suggestions for new measures or modifications of some measures. Is there anything you could suggest with regard to this? Not with regard to this exercise. If I had a problem, I would try to resolve it. But I can't think of any problem. Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Fortier. Last question in this round, 3 minutes to Mr. Cullen. Just for everybody's information, we're going to suspend briefly just for a bathroom break and grab a coffee, and then we'll come back. So after Mr. Cullen's question, we'll have that break. Mr. Cullen.
Almost through the first half. Let's pop to this friend's exception and see it as a. So if an occasion where someone were to give a gift that contravened the Act and they weren't a friend, problem. But there's this loophole that if they were a close friend, it's okay, even if that friend has dealings with the government.
Well,
under the Act, as it is right now.
Well, that's where there's some confusion. I mean,
Right.
the fact of the matter is that, I think if there was an obvious case where they shouldn't be giving a gift, then, and there's some cases we've had where it depends on sometimes if the gift is sent to an office as opposed to being given under the Christmas tree,
Right.
You have to look at the circumstances in which the gift is given as well.
But I'm trying to look at this through the eyes of just, as you said, the average Canadian
Yeah.
seeing this and says, wait a second. If somebody who's lobbying the government,
Yeah.
lobbying a minister, lobbying the prime minister, is a friend, there might be some sort of exclusion for that activity if they give them a nice gift, if they buy them a nice watch or whatever. And you say if it's egregious, but the reason it's a concern is that the Prime Minister, in your report, attempted to use this exception to say this was all okay. Yeah. That somebody he hadn't had any contact with for 30 years, since the age of 13, until the time he became leader of a federal party, saw him at a funeral, his dad's funeral.
Well, I actually found it didn't fit within the definition of friend.
But even the attempt to use that definition to make the trip exceptional.
Yeah. But you see, the other side of the coin in this act is when you're exercising your powers, you're going to a meeting, you're making a decision. That's when a friend is exactly on the other side of the coin.
That's
They're
right.
excluded.
Which would have been a problem for Trudeau in a different way.
So it's
if you'd accepted the friend thing, but then he went to 2 meetings in which the Aga Khan's interests were involved.
Yeah, one way or another, there was going to be a problem.
One way or another, there was going to be a problem.
Yeah.
This whole thing, the trip and then the follow-up meetings about the Aga Khan Foundation, if you had accepted the friend argument...
That's right. I would have had a problem on the other side.
Right. So there was only versions of losing in this.
Right.
Okay. Can I just circle back for a moment to because in your report you said initially it was the Trudeau family that contacted, as was said, the Aga Khan's daughter, I believe, for the March 2016 trip? Is that?
Yeah.
That's what you said in your report anyways.
Yeah.
But we don't know who asked for the second trip, the trip that has been the attention of the Trudeau report.
No.
Did you ask anybody?
I tell you, I got an awful lot of that information from my documentary evidence and on the other one, the first one. And so it wasn't necessary for me to find that out.
But isn't that an interesting question to ask?
It's interesting as all get out, but it's not important for the purposes of the decision.
Well, why not?
Because
do you see what I mean? Because if
it wouldn't have changed any decision.
Oh, interesting. So if an occasion where an MP asks for a gift or is offered a gift, you make no distinction on that?
I didn't see the need for it here.
Okay. But can you see why, again, back to the average Canadian watching this, if a politician was out there asking for stuff, as opposed to being offered, motivation becomes an interesting thing.
Yeah, but it didn't matter here.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, I mean, there was no need to get into details that I didn't need.
Thank you, Mr. Cullen. It seems brief, it seems short because it was only 3 minutes, but we'll be coming back. So we're just going to suspend again for 5 minutes. We'll see you back in 5 minutes.